Hello, hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with myself, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan, my co-host. This week, we're joined by a distinguished scholar on Yemen, Helen Lackner, who not only is the author of Yemen in Crisis and Yemen, Poverty and Crisis, but has also spent a long time in the country in her other career as a rural development specialist. So now bringing them both in. Helen, welcome.
Thank you.
Eddie, hello. So we're here focusing on Yemen in this session. Helen, you've written extensively, and I've followed your writing in various different forums on it. We'll go round looking at the whole situation in Yemen from in and out, but perhaps we need to start with what catches the headlines, who are the Houthi. And if I can ask you, because Yemen traditionally has been groups of people or perhaps tribes who dominate, but the Houthi are not a tribe. So could you just outline who the Houthi are before we move on to their politics?
Yeah, great. Well, basically, as you just pointed out, and many people get wrong, so I'm pleased you pointed it out, is the Houthis are not a tribe. They are a family who are members of the Sada, which is the Yemeni way of talking about the descendants of the Prophet, which are elsewhere known as Hashemites or Ashraf. And therefore, they are basically a separate group, which in terms of social hierarchy, tends to be considered the top group socially, but they're a much smaller minority. Of course, as you pointed out, the tribes are the vast majority of the Yemeni population. And so, yeah, so basically, that's who they are. They also originate from the far northwest of the country, around the city of Saada, which is not quite the same thing as Sada. They have been there, and they have been an influential family there for many decades. And at the moment, it is the Houthi family who leads this particular faction of Zaydism, which is again the characteristic of the Shia in Yemen, which are favours Shia as opposed to the 12ers Shia found in Iran. And I'm not sure that you want to go much further into that side of things at this point.
Well, other than to say that, Eddie, you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Helen. That's admirably succinct, and I think that added more information in a couple of sentences than most people I listen to the radio manage in an entire broadcast. But can you just you mentioned Zaydism? Can you mention the ideological vision that is shaping their behaviour, or not? So, what is can you summarise their ideological viewpoint?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is particularly important because the Houthi Zaydis actually differ ideologically to some extent from other Zaydis. But there is one point in common, which is they do consider that the Sada, i.e. the descendants of the Prophet, have basically an innate right to rule, and indeed that they are the main social group that has the right to be the rulers of the country, both politically and religiously and socially. So that is a very important factor. And I think if you look at it more widely, I think one of the other characteristics of the Houthi movement is that they are very, very explicitly anti-Israel, anti-US, and pro-Palestinian, as is made very clear in their standard slogan, which is repeated, on every occasion, three of whose items are death to America, death to Israel, and curse on the Jews. And the other two elements, are victory to Islam and God is great. So, if you look at their ideology, although you can go into slightly more subtle aspects, this really does summarize it. These two factors really do summarize their ideology.
So do they just, can I just last question ideology, because it really interests me. I spent a lot of time in Arabia, and obviously I've been down to the southwest border, just over. And the Zaidi issue, of course, is relevant to Saudi Arabia because there's a minority of Zaidis in southwest Saudi Arabia. So the issue did come up. But in terms of how they propagate,
I think the southwest of Arabia is Ismailis.
oh, you are quite right. Forgive me, Helen. I'm showing my ignorance.
It's another faction, but
well, Ismaili, yes, these are fighters. Anyway, so the thing is that in terms of how is the ideology disseminated? I mean, does it come out of the mosque? Does it come out of the religious hierarchy? And how did they disseminate? Is it through the mosques, or is it through the schools, or is it now infusing the state institutions of the government?
I'm glad you're asking that question, because that's really important. Yes, of course, it's spread through the mosques and through the media, the social media, and the ordinary media that they're using, the television, the radio, the papers, etc. But the most significant in terms of the long run is the way it is transmitted through the education system. And they have changed and transformed the education system and made major modifications, which means that you now have, children who, well, basically young adults who have been had this propaganda ingrained into them now for more than a decade through the education system. And they also have their summer schools where, people are really forced into coming into the, into these events and these periods of military. They're basically summer camps, but they include both ideological, propaganda and, of course, some military training.
So how many people do you think at this point would you say constitutes the community that would define itself or could be defined as Houthi? How many people?
I have never really tried to add them up. I think it's difficult to tell because, not everybody in the area that they control. I mean, they control 2/3 of the population in terms of, geography of the area that is under their control. And that is about 2/3 of the population of the country. So we're talking about 20 million people or so. But I don't think you can say that, the actual number of people who are actually genuinely committed to Houthi ideology is most certainly nowhere near that number. But I wouldn't like to put a number on it. If you'd given me advance notice, I'd have had some time to think about it and try and do some plotting and scheming. But just offhand, I wouldn't like to give a figure.
But what I'm puzzled about, back to some of the politics there, is the slogan is clearly regional, looking at Israel, talking about death to America, or quite sort of similar to what Khomeini was producing from a very different kind of Shi'ism. But the Houthi are not really a regional player. I mean, their focus is on Yemen. And they come from the area, North Yemen, the north bit of North Yemen, where traditionally those particularly big tribes there have always provided the kind of mainstay to the main government. So as I see it, they come from a Yemeni political position, and their particular focus in the end would be what happens in Yemen.
Well, yes and no, I think is the way I'd respond to that. Until basically last October, almost all their activities and interests were focused on Yemen and on taking control over Yemen. But you also have to remember or recall that, Badreddin al-Houthi and Hussein al-Houthi and many of them also went to Iran in the last few decades for religious training. And they did come back with some influence, and they have, or at least some of them have, a lot of respect for Khomeini, not necessarily for Khamenei. And that, in a sense, that slogan was largely brought back. But until last October, the internationalist aspect of the slogan was really, paper, because it did not affect the activities. But again, I think when you look at the Houthis, just as when you look at any other political group, there are different tendencies within the Houthi movement. And, you have the most extreme tendency, which have always wanted to go, go to basically to Jerusalem. And you have the more, you could say, moderate section of the Houthis who basically want to control Yemen. So yes, until last October, you could say the international slogan was really a paper statement, which had no practical implementation whatever, which is no longer the case, as we all know.
with the action in the Red Sea,
Yeah,
which has brought them to much more regional significance.
absolutely, it's brought them to regional and international significance. I mean, it's not. Until last October or November, when they got involved, I mean, you would find quite a lot of people who knew something about the area and had some interest in the area, who wouldn't know very much, if anything, about the Houthis. Whereas now, basically large numbers of people everywhere know about them, basically as a result of the attacks of the actions in the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and basically blocking the Suez, or not blocking, but limiting traffic in the Suez Canal.
So this sort of often used phrase, Iranian proxy and the axis of resistance. I've always considered the Houthi to be slightly distant from that position, as opposed to Hezbollah, which was very much more set up by Iran. Hamas runs its own separate operation, and the militias in Iraq owe a lot to Iran. But the Houthi have their own particular local position, which happens to coincide with Iran. So I don't see them as much as a proxy, as an ally. How would you?
Indeed. Thank you very much for putting it that way, because I also spend a lot of my energy trying to argue about the fact that the Houthis are not Iranian proxies. And precisely, they have acted independently. They do make their own decisions. If they happen to coincide with what the Iranians want, then that's great. And if it doesn't coincide with what the Iranians want, they'll carry on regardless. So, and they are indeed allies. Of course, they are now, I mean, with the expansion of their activities, they are more dependent on Iranian technical support for the kind of weaponry they're using in the Red Sea and elsewhere than they were previously. But I mean, I've always argued that, should Iranian support end tomorrow, the Houthis would continue, certainly within Yemen. I'm talking about the period when the Houthis were, exclusively active in Yemen itself. So I think, that the way you put it is absolutely correct. It is, it's an alliance. Both sides benefit. I mean, for the Iranians, it has been for a long time an incredibly cheap and effective way of causing massive irritation to the Saudis. It was before, almost a year and a half ago, when there was the kind of reconciliation, if one wants to use that terminology. So we have, you basically have two groups or two organizations that have similar objectives in certain senses, and but that remain independent. But
turning from the Houthis to the internationally recognized government, which, as I understand, and I'm ready to be corrected, is a sort of relatively ineffective operation. It's sort of propped up by its two allies, the Emiratis and the Saudis. And does it have a kind of popular or a political force of its own?
Well, I think the first thing you have to remember about the internationally recognized government is that it's basically a conglomerate of extremely different rival groups. Until 2022, it was supposedly run by President Hadi, who had been there since 2012, and, who couldn't hold it together. Then in April 2022, the Saudis and the Emiratis agreed, and they created this thing called the Presidential Leadership Council of 8 men, which, basically had 4 who were close to the Saudis and 4 who were close to the Emiratis. And basically all of them almost totally disagree with each other. So although it may be an exaggeration to call them warlords, I think that that description, it fits at least some of them. And they are basically extremely, they're at least as busy trying to outdo each other as they are to fight the Houthis. So yes, as you pointed out, they are extremely ineffective, and they're ineffective basically for 2 reasons. One, their own divisions. Well, actually more than 2 reasons. Their own divisions. The fact that the support they're getting from the Saudis and the Emiratis is also contributing to the divisions. And thirdly, that, because of their divisions and other reasons, the fact that, their equipment and their military activities and etc., they are basically enabling the Houthis to be stronger by the very fact, the weaker they are, the stronger the Houthis are. It's a sort of fairly automatic reaction. So yes, and they are ineffective in the sense that, I'm currently doing some work looking at local governance in different areas. And when you look at local governance in the area under Houthi control, it's very centralized and you can relatively generalize from one area to the other. This is not the case when you're looking at the area under the internationally recognized government. I mean, just one example, this week, I think it's this week or last week, a national youth meeting was supposed to be happening, with supported by international organizations in Aden, with youth representatives, presumably from all over Yemen, or at least all over internationally recognized Yemen. And the Southern Transitional Council simply didn't allow it to happen. They closed the hall in which it was supposed to happen, and they prevented people from attending. I mean, that just happens to be the latest example, but there are others. So if you look at what's supposed to be the interim capital of Aden, it is not governed by the internationally recognized government. It is governed largely by the Southern Transitional Council, which itself is merely one of many Southern separatist factions. So, it gives you an idea of the sense of and financially, the internationally recognized government is now totally 95% or thereabouts, dependent on support from the Saudis and the Emiratis, for the simple reasons that the main form of other income the government had was from the very limited, but still important, export of hydrocarbons. Well, gas exports stopped in 2015 when the civil war started, and oil exports, however limited they were stopped in October 2022 when the Houthis attacked the exporting ports.
So you've come now to the Emiratis and the Saudis, who I wanted to ask about. We'll perhaps take them separately, but starting with the Emiratis, I understood that their main interest, when they were faced with 2011 and the Arab Spring, both those 2 Gulf states felt that they had an existential crisis against tackling them. And then with 2014 and Daesh, they felt it much more urgently. So these rather 2 unlikely allies, historic rivals, suddenly sprung together and went to Yemen in a military force, and in 2015 started actually fighting the Houthi, stopping their advance. My understanding was that the Emiratis were not so interested in the Houthi, but were very, very interested in the south, particularly the ports, as they've been building a network of ports along the southern peninsular coast in Somalia and in the Red Sea. And so as part of that, they had a sort of natural maritime Arab connection to the coastline. And so they formed an alliance with the Southern Transitional Council and quite quickly achieved some kind of stability, perhaps around Aden. So am I correct in thinking that the Emirati focus and the current alliance with the Southern Transitional Council and its leader, Aidarus al-Zubaydi, is the sort of linchpin of their policy?
I think I fully agree with what you're saying with respect to their interest in ports. But I think it's also worth remembering that they would also quite like to have access to Hodeidah, which is a major port on the Red Sea. So, so they do have some interest in the Houthis to that extent. I think also, I would also not agree with the statement about stability in Aden. I mean, Aden is far more unstable nowadays than Sana'a is. I mean, I remember times when we've always felt stress and tension in Sana'a, and we went to Aden to kind of relax. And now it's absolutely the opposite. If you're in Sana'a, as long as you don't do anything or say anything against the Houthis, you're perfectly fine. Whereas in Aden, you don't know when the next bomb's going to come up, or who is actually going to be attacking anybody. So you have serious instability in Aden. I think the other thing is that the STC is largely very influenced by the Emiratis. And without the Emiratis, it would be nowhere. I mean, it is where it is, and it's known, throughout the world, thanks to Emirati diplomatic support, financial support, etc., and paying for people coming in on delegations all over the place. But the STC is not the only representative of Southern separatists, and two, the Emiratis don't just support Southern separatists. You have to remember that one of the main factions or internationally recognized government factions that they support is that of Tariq Saleh, the nephew of the former president. And he is most absolutely not a separatist. And I suspect that given the option, he'd probably be happier to cooperate with the Houthis than with the STC. This is speculation. I have absolutely, no evidence to back up this thought.
And he controls some territory on the Red Sea coast?
Yes, he controls the Bab al-Mandab and basically the section of the southern Tihama, i.e. I'm not sure, about 100 kilometers or maybe more, maybe 150 kilometers north of the Bab al-Mandab on the Red Sea coast, which, they had more. They were almost in Hodeidah in 2021, but they withdrew when they decided to go in, when they went and moved most of their troops to Marib to stop the Houthi attacks on Marib. So now the Houthis control, if you look between Hodeidah and the Bab al-Mandab, they control about half the distance, and Tariq Saleh controls the other half. But that's of the absolute coastal bit. As soon as you get into the hills, there's a lot more Houthis.
And so, but then they are Emirati allies, you say?
They are also Emirati allies, and
Right.
the third group, who are generally regarded as Emirati allies, are the Amalika. But that group really it's wrong to call it a single group because it's much more varied within it. Though they are all Salafis.
And
But
this is the group sometimes translated as Giants Brigade.
Yeah. I mean, as you were mentioning earlier, the important element is that for the Emiratis, the prime enemy from 2011 onwards was anything that remotely looked like the Muslim Brotherhood. And in that sense, the Emiratis are supporting in the STC anybody who is against Islah, which they regard as being the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, Islah is a complex and a very important Yemeni political party, but it's not exclusively Muslim Brothers. It basically has three components. It has the northern tribal component, which are the kind of tribal people you were talking about earlier in the area where the Houthis are particularly strong. It has a Salafi element, and it has the Muslim Brotherhood element. And of course, the balance of power between those three varies at different times. So for the Emiratis, that is really the most important element, and they have been active, with foreign support, and they brought in American contractors, so-called, to attack people in Aden in the last few years who were because the Islah Party is part of the internationally recognized government.
And then further north, you've got the Saudis with their forces, I think mainly based in Marib and around that, who eventually need to reach some kind of balance with the Houthis, whether it's currently there's a truce, but presumably Mohammed bin Salman, with his local focus on developing Saudi Arabia, has got stuck in this long war in Yemen, and presumably he would quite like to take Saudi Arabia out of it and find some kind of endgame.
Absolutely, I think as far as he's concerned, they are out. I mean, they are no longer, since the truce of 2022, they haven't been militarily involved, except there are very occasional small sort of border clashes in the northwest. But I think they consider themselves to be out. And they were in negotiations directly with the Houthis from 2022 until possibly today. But they were, into active negotiations, and they had supposedly agreed a deal which was described as a roadmap supported by the United Nations Special Envoy. But in fact, that is basically on hold, simply because with the current situation and the Houthi activities in the Red Sea, it's very difficult to conclude it. And my understanding is that the Saudis would be quite happy to sign it. And for a long time, I had doubts of thinking the Houthis didn't want to sign it. But I now think that the Houthis do want to sign it. And basically what's stopping them from doing it, I think, is partly the US intervention, who are really very uncomfortable about the Saudis making an agreement with the Houthis, while the Houthis are basically occasionally attacking US naval forces in the Red Sea.
So
and
if one was to speculate, you would say that in the event of some kind of calming down in Gaza or whatever happens there, an end to the fighting in the Red Sea from the Houthi, then that truce could then go into place.
Oh, the truce is basically still effective, but the agreement, no, I mean, the Houthis have been quite clear that if, when the attacks on Gaza stop, and when humanitarian assistance is allowed to come into Gaza unhindered, and the blockade on Gaza stops, that they will stop their attacks. There is, there's no real reason to believe that they wouldn't do it.
Right.
But they have, they've not always done what they said they would do. No, sorry, they usually do what they say they're going to do. So on the whole, it seems to be a wise move to believe what they're threatening or what they're saying they're going to do. So from that point of view, but I'm not totally convinced that the formal agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis is not going to happen. I think it could happen. I think the other important thing one has to remember is that because of the lengthy negotiations and the success of the Houthis, the agreement, the formal agreement, when it happens, will officially be an agreement between the Houthis and the internationally recognized government, because the Saudis have successfully persuaded the Houthis, and I think that's one of the biggest concessions the Houthis have made, because the Houthis used to insist that the Saudis are participants in the war. And being participant in the war would make them, of course, liable to international court jurisdictions in terms of war crimes of the activities that happened between 2015 and 2022. So the Saudis have persuaded the Houthis to make the Saudis mediators and witnesses. So formally, the agreement would be between the Houthis and the internationally recognized government, while with the Saudis and probably the Yemenis and others being witnesses to the discussion. And so that makes quite a significant difference to the situation. And of course, the the internationally recognized government had no say in the details of this roadmap and agreement. And indeed, as my understanding is that the United Nations Special Envoy, who would be left with the job of getting this implemented and getting this roadmap going, I think had, if any, extremely little input in the nature of this agreement.
So it's a Saudi Houthi arrangement.
It's the Saudi Houthi arrangement, which will be presented in the form of a Saudi internationally recognized government.
Understood.
UN arrangement.
Eddie, jump in.
Fascinating. I'm really appreciating your insights. On a more mundane question, which of course preoccupies people here in the United Kingdom, where I am, who get the occasional snippet of news and see the advertisements. How would you describe the humanitarian conditions, the economic conditions in the areas that the Houthi control? And everything we see suggests that humanitarian conditions are really bad. How do you describe those? And how does the Houthi government manage to finance what it does in an economy which, from every perspective, seems to be non-functioning?
Thanks for bringing this up. I think that's really important. Basically, the quick answer is bad and getting worse, but I'll go into a bit more detail, which is that if you look at the UN Humanitarian Response Plan for 2023, it was the request was for $4.3 billion US, where it was financed at about 40%. The request for 2024 has been only 2.7 billion. And it has, as of yesterday, I think, been financed at 28% or just under 28%. So, that gives you a quick idea. The second element, which is very important, which is that since last December, the main distributor or the main provider of aid, which is, of basic food and basic support, is the World Food Programme. And since last December, they have stopped distributing anything in Houthi-controlled areas. They did do one-off distribution, and they're currently in the discussion for doing a second one. And I forget, there was some figure, but I forget what it was. But in any case, you have a situation where, the humanitarian living conditions and the levels of hunger are increasing. Now, there's a system the UN has a system to calculate the need, and it's called the IPC, I forget what it stands for, levels. And basically, they've just recently publicized an updated version, but that only covers the internationally recognized government areas and a couple of other very small sections within the Houthi areas. And basically, what they're saying is that the level of hunger and malnutrition is considerably increasing at the moment, and that the situation is really getting very critical. Of course, the reasons for the reduced support is, are local as well as international. I mean, international, there's all the additional demands of, Sudan and any number of other places which are really, getting quite desperate. Let alone Gaza and the Palestinian question. But basically, you have a situation where the humanitarian support is way below what is needed.
Is that both in the IRG area and the Houthi area? Are they different?
It is in both, because the total amount is much less. So it affects both areas. But but it's much worse, obviously, in the Houthi areas, because where there's much less support, and as I said, WFP support has not happened since last December. And of course, the Houthis aren't exactly helping that. I mean, they recently arrested about 60 or 70 people from the humanitarian organizations and the UN, which is hardly likely to encourage the UN organizations to increase their support. But I was going to come to the second part of Eddie's question, which is the economy.
Yes.
The Houthi incomes are basically taxing. They tax anything and everything that moves or doesn't. But of course, because there's less economy, there's less to tax. They were also very dependent on, on the impositions on the humanitarian sector, whether it's in fees or, permits or whatever. And again, as that has reduced, this has reduced their income. Their income rose considerably in 2023 when they basically forced most of the shipping that had arrived in Aden to come to Hodeidah. But, now with these activities in the Red Sea, that has dropped as well. So it's reducing their income from port fees from the Hodeidah and other neighboring ports. So basically, and I suspect one of the reasons they're putting all this additional pressure on the UN is in the hope of getting more funding. But it seems to me that, that's the least likely system to get more funding from the UN is to arrest their staff. I mean, it doesn't strike me as an obvious way of encouraging people to come and help more. But the need is definitely there.
I mean, the obvious question that flows from this is, isn't the Houthi leadership under growing pressure from the grassroots, the people who are suffering? And not just because of the food situation, but because of also the international or the American attacks. Isn't that happening? Isn't there a possibility that there would be some change, political change, as a result of the economic and social conditions?
Well, certainly the people under Houthi control were increasingly unhappy about Houthi rule in larger numbers. And, that's one element. But of course, what's happened is the Yemeni people are fully supportive of Palestine. And as long as the Houthis can say that what's happening and all the problems are now due to, the horrible Americans and everybody else attacking Palestine and not helping us and now attacking us, this means that the increased support that they got through their activities on Palestine still dominates, I think, the popular reaction. And if you look at the size of the Friday demonstrations in support of Palestine, which happen every week, they are really very, very large. And they are not, unlike other demonstrations that happened in the past, I do think the vast majority of people who attend them are genuinely going there because they want to support Palestine. Whereas in, other times you could have said that a lot of people who attend are there because they've been told to attend by the Houthis. But I think this is not the case. And the final point, in response to your question is that the Houthi leadership and the incredibly oppressive system means that they're really not very sensitive to public opinion. So you now have a public opinion which is divided between frustration at the economic circumstances and social and political circumstances, but also fully support of the Palestinian aspect of the Houthi activities. And therefore, the uprisings against the Houthis are not about to happen in a hurry, as far as I can see. Again, I'm not on the ground and I could be wrong. I mean, I certainly, there's many situations where I'd love to be wrong, and this is one of them.
Helen, you've described, as we come to a close, heading towards it, you've described, I don't know if I can call it a nation state anymore, where there is groups of different groups who have established a kind of geographical and military, perhaps economic independence, and also interlink. The Houthi, the internationally recognized government, the Southern Transitional Council, Tariq Saleh. And so at some stage, they look as though within those borders, they'll find some kind of modus vivendi. We haven't yet, well, we hope, I should say, we haven't looked to the east of the country, where you said earlier that the Southern Transitional Council was in Aden, but its influence failed when you moved through to Makalla, Hadramaut, the big area of Hadramaut, and Al-Mahra up to the Omani border. Now that I understood to be a sort of Emirati allied area. But there's also Saudis have come in there, and so it seems to be open season in terms of the two external forces, and I don't know what the internal forces are.
Yes, thanks for bringing up that side of it. I think it's the important aspect of Al-Mahra and Hadramaut is that really, particularly Hadramaut, has for the last 2 years really been the focus of the rivalry, of the open rivalry, both between the Saudis and the Emiratis and between the STC and other Yemeni factions. Within Yemen. So both the other, the problem about the IRG, when you mention it, of course, is that both Tariq Saleh and the STC are formally part of the IRG. So it's, although, I think I know what you mean and it's clear, but maybe for, viewers, we should remember to remind them of that. So, I mean, when you look at the IRG, you have the STC, you have the Tariq Saleh, you have the people who believe, clearly in some other kind of government because Tariq's not a separatist. So, it is a conglomerate of very different views. And what's happening in Hadramaut is that you have a clash. It's not a military clash, but it certainly often looks as if it might break out into a military clash any time, between, on the one hand, the military forces that are supported by the Emiratis and those that are supported by the other side and the Saudis. And they are mostly on the coast, in the coastal area. And the ones in the interior who tend to be closer to the Saudis and to belief in Hadramaut, or if anything, a united Yemen. And I think it's important to also remember that, Hadramaut is economically probably more viable as an entity than any other parts of Yemen. And also there's a long historical, connection with the Saudis, in the sense that, as we know, many Yemenis, thousands, if not millions of Yemenis have been to Saudi Arabia as workers and in different ways. And many of them came from Hadramaut because they went and were sponsored and supported, even in the socialist period, by the Hadramis who became Saudis, the big business families of bin Mahfouz, bin Laden, and a number of others. So there is a connection there, which the Emiratis do not have. There's a slightly different connection because the Emiratis also have some people of Yemeni ancestry, mainly, in fact, from the Maghreb area, who came, a few generations back and who were brought in by Sheikh Zayed and who have Emirati nationality. So you have that, but the ones in my understanding in the Emirates are more likely to be coming from Maghreb and Bayhan and those areas than they are to be coming from Hadramaut. Though there are a few Hadramis, of course. I mean, there's Hadramis everywhere in the world. So I think, the situation and the lack of outcome in this rivalry in Yemen between the Emiratis and the Saudis is really being played out at the moment in Hadramaut in particular. Less so in Mahra. I mean, Mahra really seems to be more under, if anybody, but under Saudi control, and the Omanis are try to have more influence. And again, Al-Mahra got a very small population. And so it's not, apart from the port of Nishtun and some of the smuggling that's coming in through there and through the border, it's not really, it's such an important area as Hadramaut is.
So as we close, I don't want you to necessarily get a crystal ball, but when we look at this, this collection of factions and forces that you've outlined so well within those borders, do you feel that we've come to a time after a brutal, almost decade more, that there is some kind of rough balance of multiple forces emerging, or is there still more rebalancing and more misery to come?
Well, the problem is that the balance of power at the moment is very much in favor of the Houthis. And, not only do most people outside of their area of control not want to be ruled by the Houthis, there's also a very large number of people within the area of control who don't want to be ruled by the Houthis. So, the a current deal, if it happens, an agreement, if it happens, would really leave the situation very much unclear. I mean, in the sense that, you remove the Saudis and possibly the Emiratis. I mean, removing them in one level doesn't mean that they won't continue supporting their own, friends and allies in the country. So it's very difficult to see, an outcome at the moment which would not involve a very, very strong Houthi domination. And that really is not an outcome that anybody, or at least that the vast majority of people would like to see, and certainly of Yemenis would like to see. And, I think the divisions between the two major supporters are not helping. Should the Yemenis be able to sort out and try and find an understanding, without, I mean, if you could remove the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Houthis, then you could have, a worthwhile dialogue and possibly come to a useful conclusion. I mean, the most obvious, outcome that would be reasonably satisfactory would be to go back, or to go to, because it never happened, the federal state that was proposed out of the National Dialogue Conference. I'm not suggesting that it should be a federal state of the 6 regions as they were then defined, which I think was a very, careless and rushed and unthought of system, but a federal system, a well worked out federal system would be a good outcome if
Helen,
it could happen.
On that thought, that rare practical look forward to a hopeful future, I thank you very much for your tour d'horizon of a very complex country. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope people are finding this useful.
It's been a pleasure to have you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.